Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and it's truly a delight once again to be hosting David Ignatius, who's back to discuss his latest thriller, Phantom Orbit. David, of course, has spoken at the store many times before. His latest novel is his 12th, and he's appeared at P&P for all 12. And like his previous ones, this new one has a very suspenseful plot, made up, yes, but grounded in the reporting David continues to do for his prominent day job as a columnist for the Washington Post and a frequent commentator on MSNBC's Morning Joe. For several decades now, David has managed to succeed at two careers at once. In the journalistic world, he's an accomplished columnist known especially for his informed sources in Washington's deep state, or in David's case, maybe we should say deepest state. And in the literary world, he's the author of popular thrillers that reflect the intelligence, military, and foreign policy issues that he columnizes about with such authority. Phantom Orbit reflects David's interest in particular in space weapons and the future of warfare in space. It's a topic that couldn't be more timely. In recent weeks, you may recall, there have been headlines that about Russia having considered placing in space some kind of nuclear device to damage satellites, which would effectively cripple communication and navigation networks on Earth. And actually, you don't have to wait for the future of space warfare and of space becoming a battleground in war. David, in his book, refers to efforts by Russia during its invasion of Ukraine to interfere with Ukraine's use of satellites for military communication, intelligence gathering, and targeting. In fact, much of the Ukraine war, with its extensive use of drones and electromagnetic signals to disrupt those drones, has been a conflict where space already factors in more than ever before. Against this backdrop, David has put together quite an engrossing story that involves Russian, Chinese, and American characters and a looming threat to destroy GPS satellites. It's the sort of story that enables David to showcase not only his grasp of very relevant national security concerns, but also how superpowers relate and scheme, how spies operate, and how people who are caught up in the intrigue end up dealing with sometimes very personal challenges. There's not just in the book informative stuff about satellite systems and space weapons, but also plot twists that touch on what Russia, for instance, has lost under Putin, how the CIA handles sexual harassment cases, and other important themes. There's romance, there's office politics, and some very believable spycraft. All in all, it's really a highly relevant, thoughtful, and entertaining novel. Now, to help us sort a fact from David's fiction this evening, we very fortunately have a former CIA officer serving as moderator. Dan Hoffman did 3 tours as a CIA station chief, and over the years, his postings included assignments in the former Soviet Union, Europe, and war zones in the Middle East and South Asia. He can't tell you about them because he's still obligated to maintain secrecy, but you can read about him elsewhere. He led large-scale human intelligence gathering and technical programs, and he served as director of the CIA's Middle East and North Africa division. And here's a tidbit that could mean something or nothing. A character in Phantom Orbit also is named Hoffman, Larry Hoffman. In fact, David has used the last name Hoffman for a number of characters in his books. So the plot thickens. Please join me in welcoming David Ignatius and Dan, not Larry, Hoffman.
So I asked if I could just say a word before Dan starts in. This is the 12th time that I've done this with each one of my novels. I've been here at Politics and Prose before Brad and Lissa bought it and since. And it's just a ritual for me that symbolizes the community that I write in, that I live in. And it just means a lot that everybody turned out tonight. I asked my friend Dan if he would moderate this discussion for a couple reasons, but the most important is that from what I know of his career, he embodies the things that I respect and admire in the CIA. He's held very senior, responsible positions. He's a deeply principled person. He's tough-minded and has done hard things. He and I become friends in part because I come over when Dan is with his two young sons, who he's raising now, that his wife has passed as a single parent in a wonderful way. So, Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you and hope that you're not, too vicious in your interrogation. But I want to just thank everybody for coming.
All right, thank you. Listen, it's a real honor for me to be here. This is my first time doing anything like this. Does anybody speak Russian? The Russians have there you go. Okay. The Russians have a popular saying, "Первый блин комом," the first pancake comes out lumpy. So hopefully I'll do okay at this. Now, listen, I'm going to start off by telling you I'm not an unbiased reader of this novel. I loved it. I read it in one sitting. In fact, I purposely left myself enough time so that I wouldn't have to put it down, and I didn't. This is a book about Russia, about China, about families and spying. It's about high technology and space, and the detail that you bring to all of those, including this incredible knowledge you have of Russian culture, I found to be just extraordinary. So let me start by asking you how the book got started. That's the question I always want to ask authors, and the rare opportunity I might have to actually meet with them in person. I think it's one that the audience would like to hear. How did the book get started in your mind? Why did you choose this plot, these characters? How did you mold these characters?
So it started with two ideas. One, I wanted to write about space and space weapons. In each of my recent books, I've tried to think, what's the thing that 2 years, 3 years from when I start researching, people are going to be focused on? So, I've written recently about cyber espionage and hacking, and I've written about quantum computing, and I've written about deep fakes in my last book. So when I got thinking, I thought space, the way in which the future of warfare is going to be about space and space weapons, would be really fertile ground. In my journalism, I'd been talking to the head of the Space Force, then General Jay Raymond. So I was doing all this reporting, and it reinforced a feeling that this was great terrain for writing the kind of fiction that I do. And then weirdly, I had a desire to write about a Russian, and a particular idea of what Russian story. In my last novel, the hero was from the Pittsburgh area, from McKeesport, up the Monongahela River from Pittsburgh. And he is from that part of the Rust Belt that just got crushed when it deindustrialized. And he carries as a character all that anger and hurt. And it's what drives him as a character. And I got thinking about what it must be like for Russians in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the feelings that they carry, and how, as a novelist, it would be interesting to get into that. So I did some research, and I realized that the Russia of the Pittsburgh of Russia was a place called Magnitogorsk, which Dan probably knows. It's well east of Moscow, and it's the place that Stalin dreamed he'd make the ultimate steel capital of the world. It had a mountain of iron ore that was so powerful that birds would get confused and compasses wouldn't work. So I applied to the Russian embassy here for a visa to go to Magnitogorsk and do my research on the ground, and then along came the invasion of Ukraine. And believe it or not, I still don't know why, I was on the first list of banned individuals. So I am forbidden by Russia from, it says, ever going to Russia again in my life. So there went my research trip to Magnitogorsk. Thank God for the internet, for Google Earth. You can walk the streets of Magnitogorsk. But Dan, it was those two things: the desire to write about space, and then this idea of the character who in the book is Ivan Volkov. And then, it's like a ball rolling downhill. It just finds its own course, and other characters begin to define themselves. You learn more about them, and ends up as the book that Dan read.
If there's one thing I learned at the CIA, it's that arguably the most important quality we could have is empathy, like to see the world through somebody else's eyes. Maybe you don't always have sympathy for Kim Jong-un or Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, but you can see the world through their eyes. And I think that's what you do magnificently in this book. Your protagonist, Volkov, when I read about him, I thought, well, he's everything that's good about Russia, and so is his son. Volkov's father, and I'm going to quote your book here, died after drinking too much vodka and eating too many lies. Now, you could say that a lot about many Russians whom I met over the 5 years I spent there, but I thought your portrayal of that family, the three of them, Volkov, his father, and the son, really did reflect Russia. And yet you say that your book is a love letter to Russia that was and may be again. So tell me, and I do have some predisposed bias against Russia, I'll admit, mostly against the KGB and Vladimir Putin's cronies. But tell me, what's lovable about Russia?
So, you've seen the most unlovable side, and I would never try to talk you out of your feelings. What's lovable about Russia is that yearning. I mean, I think of Russia, Dan, as the symbol on the national seal, this eagle looking in two directions at once, looking west, looking east. It's fundamentally confused about its identity, with a permanent chip on its shoulder. This kind of sense that it's unloved, rejected, all the things that Putin plays on, and yet Russia is also the inescapably the birthplace of some of the authors I enjoy reading most. I love Tolstoy. I think Anna Karenina is one of the absolute sublime novels I've ever read. I also love reading Dostoevsky. I end up quoting Dostoevsky in this book. So those qualities in Russia and Russians, I love, and I tried to get that the Russian character that's tough, but does have a yearning for dignity and good things in my characters.
So I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but I'm going to give a little bit away right now. There's a key moment in intelligence operations when we recruit a source, somebody who knows the plans and intentions of an adversary of ours. And oftentimes, when someone decides that they are ready to work for the CIA, I mean, there's something that triggers that risk calculus in their mind, because they're taking a risk. And in the case of Russia, it's a bullet to the back of your head in an unmarked grave. So there's some serious thinking that goes on before someone decides that they want to go work for the CIA, for all that entails. What I thought that you really handled well in the book are those triggers, the moments when your the key protagonists in your book make life and death decisions and the reasons why they do it. So you could talk about Edith Ryan and some of the decisions that she made, or Volkov, or in China, there's your protagonist in China. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, seeing the world through the eyes of those who decide that maybe they want to betray their country for the sake of their country.
So that's well said. You can see why Dan was such a good intelligence officer. I want to just go back to something you said in your earlier question, and then come back to this question of crossing the line. So I've always thought that something that my business of journalism and your business of espionage have totally in common is the need to develop relations of absolute trust. And that requires empathy. Something that's been a rule for me as a journalist is the idea that people want to tell their stories. There is something human that wants to tell you the truth about what happened. But they want to tell their stories to somebody who understands enough about them and what they've lived through to get it, to get the story. So before I interview somebody, I spend hours learning about their world, learning about what motivates them, what brings them to this interaction with me. So that's a kind of empathy. I'm, as you said, trying to see the world through their eyes so that I can encourage them to tell me things that are important. People who talk to journalists aren't usually risking their lives, but they are taking risks. And sometimes I feel that we have a responsibility in my business because we've been through it. I've been doing this for more than 40 years. I know what happens when the story comes out. And I know the dangers that somebody is running in letting me tell their story. So I let people think about it. And sometimes before the story appears, we'll just have an honest conversation with them. Here's what's going to happen when this story is published. Here's what you should think about. I always let people look at the words that I intend to quote because they have to live with them. I don't. I'll go on and I'll write another story, another column, but they'll live for that person on the internet forever. So I always let people look carefully. People rarely take back what they said. Sometimes they'll add even more. But I do think, Dan, that thing that you and I both know about dealing with people in difficult situations and getting them to do something for complicated reasons. I mean, the reasons people talk to journalists sometimes involve revenge, sometimes involve a deep idealism, wanting to share the story. Sometimes, the motives, are unattractive. They hate somebody and they want to bring that person down. We usually decide we don't really care why. We want the information, just as you probably decide. Whatever brings this person to the point of being recruited as an agent is less important than that transaction. But I do think there's some ways in which what we do is entirely different, but there's some similarities.
Yeah, and I think that the individual journalist has a lot of impact on that too. Someone might talk to you, but not talk to somebody else. And we found that at CIA as well. So someone might not want to talk to me, but they might talk to my friend Paul instead. Maybe Paul recruits the source and I don't, but that's okay too. So if anyone was awake at 6 a.m. like I was, cooking bacon for my son before he went to school, heard you on Morning Joe, and you talked about the next war beginning in space. So let's talk a little bit about that, like the role that satellite systems have played in the war in Ukraine.
So I do think Ukraine is the first space war. we don't think of it that way, but I've been there 4 times since the war began. And on each trip, I'm more struck by the importance of technology. And I've been able, because of who I've traveled with and seen there, to get a sense of the space dimension. So let me just describe what I saw in December 2022 with a Ukrainian military officer looking at systems on a screen that had been provided by American companies. So we were looking at, as I remember, Kherson in the south, an area where there'd been heavy fighting. And this person, as he would do if, in his combat headquarters, dialed into the commercial satellite coverage available from companies like Maxar, Capella, Planet Labs, I think. There are a half dozen companies that provide optical images like what the National Reconnaissance Office used to have as the exclusive super secret spying capability. You can buy it now. You can buy thermal imaging, which will allow you to see explosions. You can buy synthetic aperture radar imagery, which allows you to get 3-dimensional. These used to be absolutely, the crown jewels for our intelligence. You can get signals intelligence of a limited sort, again, from these commercial providers. So Ukraine has been able to dial in these commercial satellite assets, use them to do intelligence analysis of where the Russians are, see them from overhead as if it was a superpower, and then dial in targeting with precise coordinates, again, using systems we and American companies have provided to target the Russians. I mean, in the first 18 months of the war, if Russia was getting its butt kicked, as it was in part because of these systems that people generally don't know about, but really are powerful. It is a new kind of warfare. When I was back in this most recent trip a month ago, I saw new iterations of these systems that allow you to visualize. I mean, now this is a war of electronic warfare, jamming, because of the ability to use all this intelligence to target. Now they're jamming the weapons as they come in. They're enormous air defense complexes. So now you've got systems that allow you to see all the interference and move your drone or your whatever around, as if you're steering it. And soon, the Ukrainians are extraordinarily good at this. They will have artificial intelligence inside their drones that's pre-programmed. So even if there's no connectivity to satellites, no way to steer them from the command post where they originated, they'll still be able to get to their targets. And Ukraine is now striking 200 miles east of Moscow. They've had drone strikes. Their drones have taken out 14% of Russia's refining capacity, the last I checked, which was a month ago. So when I say this is a satellite war, I mean it. And the problem is the Russians understand that. And they have threatened, back in 2022 for the first time, they had one of their ambassadors at the UN say, hey, Elon Musk and commercial companies, you're targets. We regard you as, our part of our adversary in this war. They didn't follow through on that, but the thing that surfaced in February when Congressman Mike Turner said there's this terrible Russian threat, basically is Russia's answer to all these. So Elon Musk has 5,000 satellites in low Earth orbit, and he's on his way to probably double that at least. Amazon is about to launch its own version called Kuiper that will have initially 2,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. And the Russians and Chinese have nothing like this. And the capabilities of these systems, I don't have to tell you, just in every direction. And what are the Russians going to do about it? And so what our intelligence community discovered was they were thinking our only response in a super crisis might be to detonate a nuclear weapon in low Earth orbit and just blow all these satellites out of the heavens and leave a debris field that would basically make this low Earth orbit area impossible to transit for a generation. I mean, it's just a nightmare scenario. But that's how threatened they feel by the developments. You know, next time you see a picture of Elon Musk, pause before you think, what a jerk, and think about what he's done with SpaceX and Starlink.
So let's say 2 hours ago, I'm thinking about how I'm going to get here from Tyson's Corner. And in my early days at CIA, I would have done some map reconnaissance and tried to find some cut-throughs and done my best guess at how to get here at the right time and not be late. But now, you know, of course, I just dial up Waze and see what I know how to get here, but I'm looking for the fastest route with the least amount of traffic, and Waze is telling me where there are accidents. And so I'm going to get here as fast as I can, and I'm relying on GPS to do it. So one part of your book certainly describes how vulnerable GPS is. So maybe you'd like to address that and tell us how worried we should be about not being able to get from one place to another when there's a really important event like tonight's and you don't want to be late for it.
So you're going to have to go on Dead Reckoning to Politics and Prose. You're going to have that hardwired. So the book opens with a character that Dan and I were talking about, this likable Russian, Ivan Volkov, in the real time, right now, in the middle of the Ukraine war, deciding that Russia and China have developed what he thinks of as a kill switch that can cripple and disable GPS and everything that hangs off of it. You know, every time we use our cell phones, it's locating itself, through 4 GPS satellite points. Every time, obviously, we get on an airplane, every time we do pretty much anything, this network in low Earth orbit or with GPS higher orbit is crucial. So the threat that Volkov sees to GPS, he thinks he has to share with the CIA. He feels he's not a traitor. He's a scientist. He sends a message via the CIA's website. Dan knows that there's an invitation to the whole world. If you have information that you think you should share, here's how to do it. Here's a secure way to communicate that information, and he does, obviously at some risk. And there's no answer. And through the book, in different ways, people don't want to respond to him. And the puzzle of why that is the sort of central. I want to go into it because that's what the plot's all about. So there are redundant systems to back up GPS. People have thought about somebody trying to cripple it. The book describes something that people probably never thought about, I hope. It's interesting that many countries now have their own systems. China has a system called Beidou, which is pretty sophisticated. Russia, for years, has had a system called GLONASS. The Europeans have so there are lots of these global positioning systems, but the best and really the essential state-of-the-art one is the American one. And if it ever went down, if it was ever crippled, I think the disruption to our lives, to commerce, to transportation, it would be, it would take a long time to recover from.
So I think the war in Ukraine has exposed this century's phenomenon of a axis of tyranny, I like to call it. China and Russia, Iran and North Korea aligned together against the West. And you've emphasized their collective interest, but certainly Russia and China's interest, but not exclusively. The other two also very interested in space. Based on your research and all that you know, Can you talk a little bit about where you think space ranks? Specifically, let's start with China, Russia on their list of intelligence priorities, not just the collection, but then more about how they might use it against us.
So Russia, was the first space superpower. I'm old enough to remember the Sputnik moment in 1957 that stunned every American who was alive then. My God, the Russians have beaten us into space. They had the first cosmonaut. They were dominant. They're not now, and they won't become so again, in my judgment. The Chinese are incredibly inventive and advanced, in particular in thinking about the military uses of space and the ways to think about disabling our adversaries' capabilities in space. They've tested anti-satellite weapons. They have satellites I describe in the book that search, identify, and could attack, could take out of orbit satellites that they thought were part of our military network. They have something that I describe in the book. There's some beyond the geocentric orbit, where the satellites that stay in a fixed position are. There's something that's known as the graveyard zone, which is way out there in space. And when satellites are too old to function, they get kicked into the graveyard zone to go die. And a Chinese satellite went into the graveyard zone, and we sort of lost interest, and there it is out there. And guess what? It came back to life. It fired its engines and moved back into geocentric orbit to do who knows what. It was a zombie, basically. It died and it came back. So that's why I think the space stuff is pretty cool, and that's an example of the kind of thing China is doing that makes people nervous. They say one more thing from the book. So the book, after this opening with Volkov worrying about crippling of the GPS system, dials back to 1995 when Volkov is a graduate student in Beijing because he can't afford tuition at home at Moscow State University, so he's gotten a scholarship in China. And we see in that period when China has nothing in space but understands how important it's going to be, the ways that the Chinese, in particular the Chinese lead character, whose name is Cao Lin, nominally a professor in the Academy of Sciences, the ways that they begin thinking, even though they don't have anything in space, how can they begin to get inside of America's systems, inside the supply chain? How can they begin making the little things that go into the big systems and make those vulnerable and ultimately attempt to cripple them? So the thing that the country to take seriously as an adversary in space is China. In some aspects of this, they were way ahead of us. It's why we have a Space Force today, in my judgment. Dan, you tell me if you agree with this, but I think the Air Force basically dropped the ball. The Air Force was responsible for space, and now and forever, it's going to be fighter pilots who are going to run the Air Force. It's understandable. And finally a judgment was made. It was during the Trump administration, but I thought at the time that it was correct, that we needed a separate force to look at space and space systems, that the Air Force couldn't do it on its own. It was too much of a burden. But again, Dan, I don't know if you think that's right.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think there's no doubt that this has become a super high priority for the intelligence community for collection. Aside from those who will use the intelligence to protect us, it's also, a key requirement for us to go out and collect on, which is why we need people who know something about space to be like new hires at CIA, which is why Edith Ryan was an important person, and it was too bad they let her go. But you'll have to read the book to learn about all of that.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah. So listen, you've been writing about the CIA for decades. I have to take advantage of the opportunity to ask you about how you've seen the agency, our arc of evolution of the CIA over the past 40 years. If you can describe that a little bit.
So I think that arc has been a painful one, in part because the CIA used to have the wind at its back, as the United States did. You know, we had a kind of dominance in the world. I can remember when I first went to Beirut as a journalist in 1980, and I had the impression that everybody in town, I'm looking at my friend Sam, wanted to work for the CIA. I mean, like, you weren't anybody in Lebanon unless you were on the agency payroll. People wanted to be our friends. They wanted to. So in a sense, it was easy, and we developed this incredible reach. Awful lot of mistakes were made in that period. We could talk about the mistakes, the misdeeds. They're familiar to all of us. They've been investigated and properly so. And we now have a system of congressional oversight that I think is good for everybody, including the CIA. I worry that in this modern era where it's hard for Dan Hoffman to cross a border because people have your iris scan and they have every aspect of your DNA profile, your ability to move across borders and do things that intelligence officers do is much more limited. So I think that's a problem. I worry that what we know from human sources in China is severely limited. The Chinese wiped out the networks that we had. I've written about that in a short novel that was serialized in the Post last summer. But they basically took apart the networks that we had built over a generation. I worry that our intelligence picture of Russia obviously is astounding. I mean, we knew everything about what they were going to do in Ukraine. Nobody would believe the United States. Thank goodness we had in Bill Burns a director who pushed the limits and decided to declassify things and make them available and make people know what Russia was about to do. Even the Ukrainians didn't believe it for a while. So I think the CIA is very what I worry about most, Dan, is that it's too big and too bureaucratic. I think intelligence agencies, like any organization, are at their best when they're nimble. And I'm worried about just the sort of growth and sort of the management culture. And, you got to get promoted. And, you've been chief of station here, but you now need to do this. And I'm not sure I understand the system of the reorganization that basically created mixed analysts and operators together in a way that I'm still not sure is really taken. So I worry about that. I'm struck by the fact that when President Biden has something really hard to do, he asks Bill Burns to do it. And he's not just asking Burns, he's asking our intelligence community. And that's a sign that, at a time when many parts of government don't work very well, this part still seems to have a lot of really good, really smart people. And, with Burns, and I'd say this about Avril Haines, the director of National Intelligence, we have really good people at the top.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll just add one last comment, and then we'll take some questions for anyone who would like. But President Biden turned to Bill Burns when it came to persuading the Speaker of the House to vote on the supplemental. Those were intelligence briefings that Speaker Johnson received that carried the day. So maybe there's just no limit to what Director Burns can do. Typically, the director of the CIA is focused on overseas stuff, but here he is being involved in domestic politics as well as the most trusted consigliere to the president. I found that, as a retired CIA officer, absolutely fascinating. And it's a reflection, too, of just how highly regarded Bill Burns is, that he could speak to the Republican Speaker of the House with the facts, and the Speaker of the House challenged his own assumptions, which is one of the greatest qualities you could ever ask for in a leader. You get new information, and now you have to swivel in a different direction. So that's Bill Burns. So listen, anyone who's interested, please, I think the questions are right there. Yep. Anyone who's interested, this is your opportunity to ask anything you like of our esteemed author.
And you can ask questions of Dan, too, although he may not answer them.
Mr. Hoffman, thank you for your public service. I really appreciate it. My father was in Russia when Stalin was, when Hitler's army was at the gates and got out, so he had some stories to tell. But I was wondering, I don't know if you can answer the question. I understand, it's great that Elon Musk did this, but to me it's kind of a risk when you have the private sector running satellites of, national security. They could change course, and is there any chance that there would be some law to get the government to sort of have more say in how those things operate, or any discussion about that?
So that's the thing that's worried me the most. You put your finger on what I think is the vulnerability of this public-private system that's evolved. So in one sense, America's genius is this tech ecosystem that creates an Elon Musk and lets him take risks and fail and fail and fail and finally succeed. And so a lot of those people have become very interested in national security. They're involved in space, but you find more and more small companies, with great ideas. Ukrainian military could not operate without Starlink broadband connectivity. They simply couldn't communicate with their people on the front lines. What happens when Elon Musk decides, I'm sick of this forever war in Ukraine. I have business in China. I got to make Teslas in China. I want Chinese to buy my Teslas. I can't afford this anymore. And he pulls the plug. So, there's been thinking about that, and actually Starlink has a contract with the Pentagon that would make that difficult. But I do think that as more and more of the essential national security technologies are in the hands of these brilliant private companies. Another example is the so-called National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Increasingly, it relies on the commercial satellites I was describing. I mean, why reinvent the wheel? Why ask NRO to do it when you can buy it and apply your? So they're becoming increasingly dependent on these commercial providers. Hopefully, we're a country where we share some basic values. We know who our friends are. We know who our enemies are, and we'll all be together in making these decisions. But sometimes, you look at how the country's evolving, and you worry that may not be true. And so I think this is a vulnerability. I'm not sure what the answer to it is. Again, I'm impressed by the quality, the personal integrity of many of the people who had these companies. Brad Smith at Microsoft is an example. This is somebody who's decided that Microsoft, Ukraine would have been absolutely, devastated by Russian hacking if it hadn't been for Microsoft, which saw these attacks coming in the 24 or 48 hours before the Russian invasion, saw it on its networks, and helped Ukraine to get a lot of its stuff into servers outside of Ukraine so it wouldn't be devastated. That's something Microsoft did. It was working with the U.S. government, but that's pretty amazing that a private company did that. But a future Brad Smith won't be chairman of Microsoft forever. So it worries me. I don't know the answer. I think it's a great question.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you both for doing this. I had a question about the writing process. You spoke at the beginning of this about writing novels with an eye toward future important developments in geopolitics and intelligence. And it made me think about the fact that intelligence novelists throughout history, Tom Clancy, John le Carre, have often through the research process, revealed certain truths about the process of intelligence, but also sometimes have described things that turned out, at least according to them, to be more real than they even realized. And so I was interested in asking both of you about what you think it is about the power of literature. Obviously, there's a research component, but I would imagine there's also sort of an imaginative component that results in novels like yours and like others revealing some of these truths about intelligence that maybe in some cases the writer himself may not have even been aware of.
So, Le Carré, you know, in the same way that Mario Puzo invented the language of the mob in The Godfather, you know, he taught a generation of mobsters how to talk and how to behave. And, you know, in the same way, John Le Carré created the way that people think about especially penetration agents, which didn't used to be called moles, right? I mean, they that was a Le Carré term, and now it's universal. And we all have this image of George Smiley in our minds, you know, as the kind of the ultimate intelligence professional. We see him, we remember his struggles with German, we remember his unfaithful wife. I mean, every detail of his character, you know, we think that's what an intelligence chief is like. I suspect there are not too many people in real life like George Smiley. So I think fiction does shape the way people think about real life spying. In my case as a novelist, for reasons that I take too long to explain, while I was correspondent in the Middle East, in Beirut, I came across a story about how the CIA had recruited and run for almost a decade as an asset Arafat's chief of intelligence. It was an amazing operation. Showed the CIA at its very best. There was somebody in this room who was centrally involved in that. I won't go into the details, but I ended up knowing essentially every detail of that operation. I wrote a story on the front page of the Wall Street Journal about it in February of 1983, and then the person who'd run the operation came to Beirut, and along with every other member of the CIA station, was killed when the American embassy was hit in April 1983. And the people who knew all these secrets had nobody to talk to except David. It's just like weird. How on earth would they talk to a journalist? But they did. And so I ended up knowing so much about this series of operations that although I'd never imagined that I would be a novelist, it seemed that was the only possible way to use this information. So I wrote my first novel. It was rejected by every publisher. Finally, somebody, my current publisher, Norton, accepted it. So that book's called Agents of Innocence because it told a true story that Dan's colleagues all knew was true, and it told it in some detail. Became, just it was read. It was I hope I'm not wrong in saying this, but sort of people were told you ought to read this if you want to understand what operations are about. Well, this book explains it. So that's an example where this work of fiction was drawn from life, ended up, I think, shaping perceptions. I was describing an unusually gifted case officer who had the quality that Dan was describing of building empathy and trust. People loved this guy. And when he died, they were shattered. When he and everybody else in the embassy were killed, it was just like, poof. The air went out of Lebanon for a little while. So that's an example in my own work of how a novelist can end up shaping a little bit how people think about these real-life operations.
Thanks.
I have two neighbors who are students from Kazakhstan that I invited to tonight's program. And it sounds like over there the communists are kind of wearing out their welcome and leaving the government, and younger people are in the ascendancy. How do you think Putin's emphasis on like Russian Orthodoxy as a state religion is going to affect those Muslim states?
That's a good question. I want actually to ask Dan what he thinks about that. I think Russia's problems with its periphery are going to get worse and worse. A recent example that ought to scare the hell out of the Russians was the attack at Crocus City Hall.
Yeah.
Those were Tajik migrants. ISIS-K had been expelled from Afghanistan by the Taliban, and it's like ink blots. It seeped into all those stands, all those neighboring areas, and had new operational platforms. I don't know about Kazakhstan, but certainly Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, the Russians just didn't see it coming. They are not good at understanding their periphery. I mean, think about Putin's crazy ideas about Ukraine. I mean, it's like a fever dream when you read what he writes about Ukraine. It's nuts. And I think they make similar mistakes about all the republic, what used to be the republics surrounding them. But Dan, you lived this. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I'll just add one point to that, and this is a great irony because Vladimir Putin likes to fashion himself as the KGB operative in the Kremlin, to borrow a phrase from Fiona Hill, who knows Russia as well or better than anybody I know. The irony is that this guy has committed massive intelligence failures, starting with most recently on Ukraine, failure to accurately to assess the will and the capacity of Ukraine to fight, or the will of Zelensky to stay and lead his country as Ghani didn't in Afghanistan, which was a huge difference for why Ukraine is still fighting today. That's Vladimir Putin's FSB, the Federal Security Service, their internal service, the ones that repress and suppress the population, deny them basic human rights enshrined in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And that's what they focus on. And this has caused Putin to really face a crisis, I think, of his own leadership. If you look at the mutiny from now deceased Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was leading the Wagner Group, intelligence is all about detecting threats before it goes boom. So you could preempt them before any harm is caused. Well, Prigozhin was 100+ miles from Moscow, and things were looking pretty bad by the time Vladimir Putin actually did something about it. And there's lasting ramifications for that. The Crocus City Mall terrorist attack, another massive intelligence failure. I could only imagine, God forbid anything like that happens in the United States again. We have actual oversight here and transparency and the things that Putin won't allow in his own country. But at the heart of this, in our country, in a democracy, I'd like to think we trust our state and local law enforcement and the FBI. When we see something, we say something. I don't think the FSB's relationship with the Russian population is very good, not just with Tajiks and Muslims, but Russians writ large. They spend their time denying people freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And so someone who might have spotted these Tajiks, and before an attack like that, there's reconnaissance. Just like a cyber attack, the same thing. You're going to do some reconnaissance on what you're going to hit, and that's opportunities to detect the threat before it actually occurs. They're going to miss all that because no one in their right mind is going to go volunteer information to the FSB and risk a trip to Lefortova prison, and it's not a place anybody would want to visit. But that's where Putin sent one of his senior FSB officers who was responsible for intelligence in the former Soviet Union, Sergei Beseda. So this is what Vladimir Putin has done to his own country, and it's to me at least, a fascinating irony of the guy who thinks he's a sophisticated intelligence operative when, in fact, he's kind of hampering Russia's intelligence capability. And the last point I'll make is that's why the CIA has put out 3 really great videos about recruiting Russians, gets to everything you wrote about in your book, and why the FBI has done the same thing, because it's happy hunting season on these people. And right now, as Bill Burns has said, it's a great opportunity for the CIA to make haste recruiting Russian sources.
It makes me wish that Dan was still in the field, but that's another.
So I was really interested in that first question you mentioned, the idea and the setting for the novel. You had already picked it out before the war started, and I was sort of wondering, in the past 2+ years, did anything did any, I don't know, like single event during the war sort of like change the way you thought about the novel or the way that you thought, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's a good question. As the war in Ukraine deepened to the horror that it is, with a terrible loss of life, I wanted to make sure that the way I was writing about it, was appropriate to the intensity of this experience. I felt like connecting this novel to the war in Ukraine was important. As you'll see when you read the book, the son of my hero is a very principled young man who does something that's directly connected to Russia's failures in this war, and identifies and tries to expose what those failures are. I wrote a novel about hacking and all that back in 2012, and I thought it was pretty good. And then along came Edward Snowden, and I thought real life is so much better, so much more interesting than my novel. And Eve, my wife, is sitting here, remembers my desperate attempts to rewrite the book to make it, at least kind of connect with what we were learning. So the simple answer to that is yes. The passage of time deepened my thinking about the issues that I'd started with.
David, given the technological capabilities that Ukraine possesses with the help of U.S. corporations, do you think that those capabilities are enough for Ukraine to eventually prevail in this war? I guess another way of saying, how do you see this conflict eventually being resolved?
So that's such a good question. I've always felt that this war, like most, would end with a negotiated settlement. I've wanted that to be negotiated from a position of strength by Ukraine, not a position of desperation. I see no evidence at present that Putin is ready to negotiate. He gets deeper into this psychosis, I think, but the qualities that Dan was describing. So I think he is all in. He's taking Russia into a deeper, darker place than I ever imagined. When I ask this question, so sometimes when I'm in Ukraine, I ask this of the chief of military intelligence, is your enemy Putin or is it Russia? And almost always Ukrainians answer, it's Russia. In other words, Putin embodies this sense of anger and resentment that Russians feel. But after Putin, those qualities will still be there. So, I hope that over the next, I don't think it's going to end this year. Maybe by next year, the Ukrainians will be strong enough. We'll have a different administration, but the money will still be there. $60 billion goes a long way, and they'll still be in the field fighting. And maybe at some point Putin just decides some way of negotiating a settlement that he can claim his victory and Ukraine can claim his victory will end up working out for both. The idea of this carnage at this level, it's like World War I. Nobody thought World War I would last as long as it did. They thought it was going to be over quickly. And it just dragged on, and every death was a reason for the next death. And it just, World War I was a nightmare. And I don't want the Ukraine war to be that for either country.
Thank you.
Exactly. You're exactly right.
In all of these years that you've covered war and conflict and the CIA, I think oftentimes a lot of intelligence also fails. Operations fail. So in all of these years that you've covered this topic and the CIA as well, what is the one CIA intelligence failure that stands out in your mind? And would you ever write a novel about that?
That's a good question. So the obvious answer, and I think probably the right answer, is Iraq. The misidentification of the WMD threat, led to a war that, in many ways, I think, had catastrophic effects, the failures that led to that war were so broad and deep. I think George Bush was determined to go to war, and the WMD theme was a rationale for a war that he wanted to conduct. I can remember going to Jordan in the fall before the invasion was launched in April and hearing from the palace there, Bush is going to do it. I tried to talk him. He does it. He's going to do it. He's going to go. I have to be honest and self-critical and say that as I look back on my own journalism in that period, I didn't do the job that I should have as a journalist in questioning the rationale, not about WMD, because I never took that all that seriously, but the idea that we were going to help create a different. I had written a novel called The Bank of Fear about this country governed by torture. I hated Saddam. I spent, I talked to so many people who had suffered under that regime. So when it came along, I, kind of led with what I thought was my heart, because I believed that the Iraqis needed something different and better. As I look back, people shouldn't make decisions that way. So, that I think that's the biggest mistake. And is it worth it? Now, there's so many great things that have been written about Iraq, more to come. I don't think that lends itself to a fiction, but you raise a really great question, which is writing a novel about how a catastrophe happens would be a good undertaking, and I'll think about that. So we should. Dan, I just want to close by thanking my friend Dan for doing this, thanking all of you for coming. It's really, Dan is the real deal, as I think everybody sensed. And thank you, Dan, for doing this.
And I think we can agree that Dan was not a lumpy Russian pancake, as he said at the outset.